And the Final Fantasy XIV Dawntrail website is up and running! And we get a few new tidbits of information, especially when it concerns the new field operation. However, to me, the website perfectly encapsulates the role that I think Dawntrail is playing on the grandest stage of them all for Final Fantasy XIV. Now, people have talked about before, myself included, how the story kind of represents a new beginning because, well, it is. 6.0 was the end of the Hydaelyn Zodiac arc, with Dawntrail, outside of the patches of Endwalker, being kind of the new beginning of a whole new narrative arc. But Dawntrail, to me, represents a different turning point for Final Fantasy XIV. The solidification of the content that makes up Final Fantasy XIV. And what do I mean by that? Well, over the last few years and few expansions, Final Fantasy XIV has brought to the table new types of content. But generally speaking, we wouldn't get everything all at once. We had Palace of the Dead and Heaven on High, but we didn't get a new deep dungeon with Shadowbringers. But we got one with Endwalker. We had Eureka in Stormblood and Bozja in Shadowbringers, but we didn't have one in Endwalker. We had Ishgardian Restoration in Shadowbringers, but not in Endwalker. But Endwalker had variant dungeons, while also bringing back deep dungeons. That list isn't extensive, but it's a representation of what I'm talking about here, where each expansion kind of focused on its own niche for non-rating and non-high-end gameplay. Dawntrail seemingly has everything. It has variant dungeons, it's gonna have a new deep dungeon, more Blue Mage stuff, a whole new limited job with Beastmaster, more Unreal Trials, more Hildebrand, more PvP, or at least PvP updates, new field operations, we have Cosmic Exploration, which seems to be in the style of what Ishgard Restoration was, another new ultimate, the raiding and all that, and this is what I'm talking about when I mean the solidification of the endgame of Final Fantasy XIV and like what that type of content is supposed to look like going forward. If you ask different people what their favorite endgame expansion for Final Fantasy XIV was, you'll likely get a bunch of different answers because each of these pieces of content appealed to different people. I personally was a big fan of Shadowbringers in that regard because I loved Bozja and I loved Ishgard Restoration. Those were things that helped make me feel as if I'm in a massively multiplayer online role-playing game, where you're interacting or at least seeing a whole bunch of other people. Were they perfect? No, but being able to elicit that feeling to me is sometimes more important than necessarily the quality of that content. So I'm really looking forward to Dawntrail because it's bringing to the table everything this game has kind of had in the past. And we got a bit of a new hint for the new field operation, which is what they call the Bozja/Eureka style of content, and I'll read the little blurb here. Even the most dauntless of sailors would sooner abandon ship than steer into Shade's Triangle. Be not fooled by the lush and fertile land you spy on the horizon. Men and vessels alike have been lost to its allure, never to be seen again. Yes, the wisest choice is to dismiss it as mere illusion. But of course, there are inevitably those who cannot resist the call of adventure. So it kind of sounds as if the new field operation is based on the Bermuda Triangle, which sounds awesome to me. They could have so much fun just with that singular idea, you know? And if they're able to land on their feet with all of these different styles of endgame here, then I truly believe Dawntrail could very well be received as the best endgame Final Fantasy XIV has had, at least in terms of content offering. And I firmly believe that this will be the formula they utilize going into the future because it kind of appeals to every audience in their own way. Not everyone will like field operations, variant dungeons, or whatever, and depending on the reward structure, chances are there's going to be something you like to do if you enjoy Final Fantasy XIV to begin with. I know Endwalker had deep dungeons and variant dungeons and all that, but the perception, and at least the feel, was that it lacked in terms of endgame content outside of high-end rating. And I feel a large reason for that is because they were focusing a lot on the back-end stuff and those kinds of updates like server visiting and data center travel and all that kind of stuff, alongside working on the graphical update coming into the game with Dawntrail. But with that stuff largely coming online already, or with Dawntrail's release, at least it feels as if they're able to just divert more resources to developing the endgame, which, for the future, I think is what they needed to do. MMORPGs live and die by the endgame experiences. Final Fantasy XIV is a bit of an exception because of its rock-solid narrative and story that has captivated the hearts and minds of millions of players. But despite all of that, what awaits them at Journey's End in that regard is the endgame. And I think Dawntrail is in the best position to really hook people with that. And we recently had the whole live stream they did in regards to the job design for Dawntrail. And yeah, it wasn't as much as we kind of thought. And it sounded, at least it did by Yoshi P, because he kind of said it, that they're kicking the can down the road in terms of bigger overall job changes for 8.0. Which, especially if you are unhappy with the state of job design in Endwalker, is sure to disappoint, or maybe you enjoy the job design already in-game, in which case you're probably either glad or indifferent. There's quite a few jobs in the game that don't do anything for me, like Summoner or the tanks nowadays. I don't like the tank homogenization that has gone on, and there's quite a few jobs that I feel are far too simplistic in design, but I'll just focus on the jobs that I either tolerate or I really enjoy. Viper's a big question mark to me because it very well could be way too simple and not fleshed out enough for my taste, but the whole idea that the buttons change and augment as you go through your rotation, it's very well that the complexity of that job could be a bit obfuscated by that idea. So it's one of those, well, I have to just sit down and play the thing. I always like the idea of limited jobs as well, by the way. I view them as a fun little minigame, where you don't have to overly worry yourself about balance when it comes to what tools you can give these classes, or / jobs. So I kind of argue that Endwalker was focused on the back-end side of things when it comes to Final Fantasy XIV and developing for the future, which could lead to an endgame experience that wasn't particularly thrilling. It had those, like, island sanctuaries, but for me, those kind of fell off really quickly in terms of interest. It had variant dungeons, but again, the reward structure and replayability of those was a bit and without things like field operations or lifestyle content, I just didn't have much of a reason to personally want to log in. But Dawntrail is largely addressing those concerns, so I would argue that whereas Endwalker was focused on the back-end side of things and preparing for the future, Dawntrail is kind of putting those cards on the table, and really just showing off the breadth of content that Final Fantasy XIV has had over the years, but all in one expansion. Whereas I think 8.0 probably will largely look, in terms of content itself, like Dawntrail. However, I imagine we'll see some significant job changes with 8.0. So seeing as we're kind of like in the middle part of that scenario, it seems as if Final Fantasy XIV is not only changing massively in terms of the story direction because we're entering an entire new arc for the narrative, but also it seems as if the game is trying to gear up for the future and become, or at least kind of shift its identity and double down on what it wants to be. And instead of trying to haphazardly do them all at once and possibly suffer massive consequences for doing so, it's focusing on one aspect each expansion. Endwalker was them focusing on the back end, Dawntrail focusing on the content itself, whereas 8.0 likely will focus on job design and massive overhauls in that regard. We'll have to wait and see what that turns out because, you know, plans can change, but that at least feels as if it's the direction Final Fantasy XIV is going for. And while things like the job design may sting in the short term, at least for me and some others, if I'm to be objective and take a step back and analyze the situation, this is probably the smarter play. Because I don't think job design overall is in such a position where it's a massive detriment to the overall game. For most people. You gotta bear in mind, most people aren't going to raid Ultimate or do high-end raiding or anything like that. They just want the job to be fun, and for a lot of people, they likely are. Even though the leveling, in terms of job design, could probably still use some renovations, let's be fair here. So getting all the grunt work out of the way with the last expansion, and now testing and really double downing on what they want the identity of Final Fantasy XIV's endgame to be in the future, without also trying to test massive job changes and overhauls and all that, is probably the smart thing to do. Because they can test a few ideas and a few techniques with Dawntrail in terms of job design, such as buttons changing per combo, or for your combo and stuff like that. Have things like Pictomancer and Viper to test out different styles and flares of jobs. see if these techniques really click and work for a lot of the player base, and then go from there. It may stay in the short term, but like I said, this is probably the smart thing to do for the long-term health of the game. It's always a bit disappointing we're not going to get all the pieces of endgame at launch with 7.0. We'll have to wait for the patches for quite a few of these things, the new field operation included, I believe. But when all is said and done, I imagine Dawntrail very well may be remembered as, if they're able to stick the landing, the best endgame experience Final Fantasy XIV has ever had, because it's kind of the culmination of everything it's ever had up to this point, but all in one expansion. And now's as good a time as any to try that out and just see how it works. So overall, I'm really optimistic for the state of the game for Final Fantasy XIV. It's not perfect by any stretch of the imagination, but I think they're playing the smart game here, instead of just trying to go all in and change everything all at once. Going at it piecemeal is almost certainly the smart thing to do. And with that, I'll call the video there for the day. Thank you all for tuning in. My pleasure for making the video. Stay safe, have a great day. Make sure to leave a comment down below with your thoughts or your opinions on the state of the game for Final Fantasy XIV Dawntrail, what you're most anticipating and what you're least anticipating. Love to hear your thoughts and hear your opinions and to hear your perspectives. Stay safe, have a great day. I'll see you all next time. Bye bye everybody, until we meet again.